on campus.
Okay, both of you, 1 second. It still seems to me, though, Alan, you have not explained why J Street cannot be the one organization, create itself, and say, we believe we articulate these views, give us a chance to be that mainstream organization.
Because they haven't earned that right yet. They're
But how
small,
do they earn it
they're
other than
uninfluential. What they do is they work within AIPAC. They create a very strong voice within AIPAC. I volunteer to join your group if you work with AIPAC, and we will work together. And I will promise you in exchange that I will work to get AIPAC to disassociate itself from the extreme right, from elements of the Christian right, from those who support the settlements, and accept an 80% solution which can include comfortably you and me in the same organization. That will be a victory for the Jewish people.
Let me ask.
I think this is a... I mean, I actually think this is really actually a rather silly conversation, considering that we're talking about some very important things. The notion that in the environmental community or the women's movement or any other movement that there shouldn't be more than one organization, to me is just simply silly. It's human nature to have several different places that you can call home. And I actually think the point is it's good for Israel and it's good for the Jews for there to be more than one place for people to feel comfortable. And that's the thing about the campus program, too. It's a sad statement, and you know this from the campus world better than I probably. It is a sad statement that to be labeled pro-Israel can be a turnoff now for some number of Jewish students.
We have to change that.
Last question before we go to closings. Historically, the United States international organizations, whether they be the IMF, the World Bank, have conditioned policy shifts on receipt of foreign aid. In what circumstances should the United States say to either Israel or the Arab nations, before you continue to receive U.S. aid, we expect you to change your fundamental policies?
I think it would be remarkably unproductive to put aid at risk in this discussion. I think that the thing that Israel needs to know is that its security will be guaranteed in the future. And if it is going to take risks for peace, it can't worry that U.S. aid is conditional. If you start to put that on the table, if you make that threat, then I think you take away the incentive from Israel in order to take risks for peace. So I would never be in favor of that.
And I agree, and I would bet you that if you took a poll among J Street members, you would find that there was not substantial agreement with your position and my position on that issue. Because I hear all the time from people on the left, even center left and hard left, that the big problem is American financial support of Israel and American military support of Israel, and the very people on the college campuses that don't want to have pro-Israel are also very much opposed to the United States aid for Israel, which again is an argument for why you and I should be together and leave those people at the extremes.
All right, we have, as I said at the very top, it was going to be difficult to control these two obstreperous speakers.
Three obstreperous speakers.
That's right, it turned out to be three. I didn't know that.
We flipped a coin. Alan won, and will go last. We've given each of them 5 minutes to sum up. Although they can choose to speak about any topic and necessarily will, I would ask them to think about the major point of disagreement here, because substantively there are not as many points of disagreement as the public may expect, but really it goes to the appropriate role for J Street or any other group in leaving aside the traditional voices, and whether and when and how it can or should do so. Jeremy?
Well, first of all, thank you again to the audience for it was a respectful discussion, I believe, and if at times contentious, it was respectful. And thank you, Alan and Elliot, very much for this opportunity. I think where I come out at the end of this discussion is believing that there are far more points of agreement across the American Jewish community than points of disagreement. Our own polling shows that majorities of American Jews do support a two-state solution, do oppose the expansion of settlements, do support the idea that the American government needs to play an active role, even if it means putting pressure on both sides. That doesn't involve aid, and we did test that, and in fact the majority of American Jews are not willing to put that on the table. But the notion that the active role needs to be played is a consensus opinion. So I do think that there is consensus. I believe that if you asked Washington insiders and politicians and elected officials and policymakers whether or not that is the position of the American Jewish community, they would say no. Because the voices that they have been hearing in Washington for the last 20 or 30 years have not adequately represented and not accurately represented the diversity and the breadth of the views of the American Jewish community. And that is why we do need another voice at this point in the discussion, because the political constraints that policymakers and politicians feel that they are under, the need to be reflexively hawkish on these issues, the need to go as far right as possible in their rhetoric and their positions and approaches, that acts as a severe real-world constraint on the policies that the American government can follow. And that is not healthy for the United States. I don't believe it is healthy for Israel, and frankly, I don't think it's healthy for the American Jewish community. I think that the reason why we need a new voice is because this is a time of real existential emergency for the State of Israel. Without a two-state solution, without an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict within the next 10 years, there will not be a chance any longer to have a Jewish and democratic state. Israel faces a fundamental choice. Does it want to hang on to all of this land and be a land that has more non-Jews than Jews, that can no longer be both Jewish and democratic, or does it want to compromise? Does it want to give up territory that's very painful, and does it want to make the tough compromises and concessions for peace? I think it will only happen with a helping hand from the United States government. It will only happen with our active involvement. And that will only happen if we've created the political space in our culture, in our politics, and in our government for the policymakers to feel that they can do that. The status quo is not an option. And I think that for too long, the voices that have claimed for themselves the mantle of being the arbiters of what it means to be pro-Israel and who have set the litmus tests of what it means to be pro-Israel have been satisfied to just defeat those who would choose to challenge them. And they seem to be pretty happy to rest on the status quo. I believe that the status quo is a situation in which we are heading towards the end of a train track that runs off a cliff. We've already passed the warning signs along the way. We don't know exactly when we're going to go plunging off the cliff, and I can't tell you now whether it's 2018 or 2025 when this all comes to a head, but this enterprise called Israel that we all deeply care about and that we want to see thrive and survive is heading towards that cliff. And I think that we as friends of Israel, as supporters, need to change our mode of advocacy. We need to move away from a reflexive, circle-the-wagons, defensive posture in which anybody who criticizes, anybody who dares shine a spotlight on what Israel is doing is called either anti-Semitic or a self-hating Jew, and as AIPAC labeled us over the weekend, outside the pro-Israel mainstream and extremist. No, that's not the way to conduct this discussion. These are fundamental issues that will determine whether or not Israel survives as a Jewish democratic state. I also think it's fundamental to American foreign interest, to American national security interest. We just had Jim Jones, the national security advisor, at our national conference, and he said that if he could have the president solve any one problem in the world as the most important foreign policy priority for the United States, it would be to end the Arab-Israeli conflict. And that is from the National Security Advisor of the President of the United States. This is an issue that has enormous ramifications for our American interests, and it's, again, a reason why we have every right to speak up and to criticize and to question and to try to include in that conversation as many voices as possible. But let me end with the final comment, which is I maintain that this isn't simply a matter of interest of Israel. It isn't simply a matter of national interest for the United States. It is a fundamental interest of our community. Because if we continue to act in a way that excludes and pushes away and criticizes anybody who wants to have an open conversation and to ask questions about military aid, that wants to ask questions about morality and human rights, who questions whether or not the military response in Gaza was over the top or not, whether it actually served Israel's interests or not, if they are kicked out of the community, if the doors are slammed in their face, then we are answering the very question that's always being asked. Where are the young people? Where are they going? Why are they not connected to us? If we don't make this an open and a welcoming place for this discussion, to ask some hard questions and to have some serious discussion, I think we're undercutting the future of the American Jewish community. So to me, this is a matter of the utmost importance on all three of those fronts. Again, I thank you very much for the opportunity tonight, and I think this is the beginning of an important discussion.
Thank you. Alan?
I think we all know, and we've been witness tonight to the fact that one can be extremely critical of Israeli policies without being called anti-Israel, without being thrown out of the room, without being called anti-Semitic. That is just a canard. It's not true. I go all over the country and all over the world speaking about Israel. I've been critical of certain Israeli policies for as long as I've been supporting Israel. Nobody has ever called me an anti-Semite. I get invited to speak at AIPAC, and I speak critically of some of its positions, and I speak critically of many of Israel's positions. There is room for dissent within mainstream Jewish organizations, and I think it's a paranoid delusion to think that if you remain supportive of Israel and disagree with its policies, you will somehow have no voice. The question is how to most effectively present a united voice to Congress. Now, we do have some disagreements. For example, I'll read you one quote from my distinguished friend. He's been asked, why is Iran trying to develop nuclear weapons? And he says, part of the reason is they feel backed into a corner, and did in fact. American and Israeli actions over the last years lead to a point where they feel they actually have no other vehicles. And I would not say that about Iran. I would not try in some way to descriptively justify Iran. I would answer the question clearly, as I think Mr. Ben-Ami did not answer it clearly. What would be the position of J Street if Israel had to make this excruciatingly difficult decision? If it went to the UN, if it went to the United Nations, if it went to NATO, if it tried sanctions, if it did everything in its power, and it was told that within the next 6 months, Iran is going to have deliverable nuclear weapons, and then after great debate in Israel and great introspection, a consensus was reached in a consensus government to have to take the terrible risk of doing what they did in Osirak in 1981 and attacking the nuclear facilities. Would J Street feel comfortable attacking and criticizing Israel, asking Congress to criticize Israel? I think that is a crucial question. We haven't had a clear answer to that tonight. I think we can work on an answer to that tonight together. And I do think we have more in common than we have differences. The big line in the sand for me always has to be, feel free to criticize Israel's settlement policy, its politics, a range of issues, but when it comes to Israel's ability to defend itself, I think in general the pro-Israel community has to defer. We made a deal with the people of Israel. We've said, look, your children are the ones who go to war, who get killed. That's enough of a deterrent to not wanting to go to war unless it's necessary. Your children are the ones who go to the supermarkets and the pizza shops and get blown up. Our part of the deal is we could go to Israel. We could put our children in harm's way. Instead, we stay here. And when we stay here, we have a job. It's part of the deal. We have to speak up in behalf of Israel's right to defend itself while criticizing other kinds of policies. And I think that it's crucial to speak with one voice. I would like to propose some steps to trying to unite us. One step I'd like to propose is that you invite me to speak at your convention next year. I'd be interested in seeing
earlier this evening,
whether
I
am booed or accepted. And I think AIPAC ought to invite you to speak at its next convention. I would like to see us work on developing a broader consensus on issues, on working together. Maybe the first step is to have joint conferences and an effort to see whether we can bridge gaps, and then the next step would be to create a united front. Hinei ma tov u'manayim shevet achim gam yachad. How wonderful it would be if we could sit together as brothers and sisters in one tent, a very large tent. I would never, ever exclude people from expressing dissenting views, even on national security, even on the Goldstone report. But there is a consensus within Israel and a consensus within Americans who support Israel. It's that 80% consensus. And it's a consensus represented, I think, by Amos Oz, who we both like and admire. There are two solutions to any problem of this kind, the Shakespearean and the Chekhovian. At the end of a Shakespeare play, every wrong is righted, every injustice is set straight, every sinner is punished, and everybody lies dead on the stage. At the end of a Chekhov play, everybody's disillusioned, everybody's cynical, but everybody goes on to live the next day. I'm looking for a Chekhovian solution. I'm looking for compromise. I'm looking to present one unified voice I'm looking to reduce division and to increase consensus. Jeremy, I think we can do it. We should work together.
All right. Well, let me just thank you both for participating. Thank the audience. And